The Dragoon Mountains sit quiet most days, like old sentries watching over the scrubland. From my porch, they look close enough to touch, though they're a long ride out. In the evenings, when the light leans low and the sky bruises purple, they turn into shadow. That's when the wind picks up, sliding over the ridges, carrying grit into the porch cracks and rattling the boards like a warning. Out here, a man learns to listen to what the land says. It tells you more than people do. I've been on this stretch of dirt for most of my life. 52 years old, bones set in their ways, joints stiff in the mornings, skin worn thin from sun and wind. I get by with a coat that's older than some of the hands who used to work for me back when I could afford help. Now it's just me, the stock, and the sound of my own footsteps. I don't rush for anything anymore. Work's work, and there's no one else to take it from me. I learned a while back that people are a kind of risk you can't insure against. They leave, they take, they burn through your life like a lantern turned over in dry hay. I know, because that's exactly how I lost mine. 5 years ago, a barn fire took my wife and my boy. 10 years old he was. I'd gone into town for seed. By the time I rode back, the smoke was thick and black, rolling up into a sky that felt too big to hold it. The fire didn't just burn wood and hay, it hollowed me out from the inside. Left a silence in my chest that's never really left, so I keep my days simple. Wake before the sun, feed the stock, mend what's broken, cook what I need, and not a bit more. I don't write letters, I don't get any. The Bible sits on the shelf, and I read from it some nights. Not sure I believe all of it anymore, but it's something to hold on to when the dark feels bigger than the walls. Routine is safer than hope. The land has a way of folding you into its rhythm. It doesn't care about what you've lost or who you miss. It just keeps on wind, sun, dust, rain. And you keep on too, if you mean to survive. Folks in town don't see me much. Maybe they think I'm stubborn. Maybe they know I'm just tired. Either way, I'm fine with it. I've got no use for talk that doesn't fix a fence or feed a horse. A man learns not to expect much. It's easier that way. But no matter how much you close yourself off, there's always that one sound, that one thing, that cuts through the quiet and reminds you you're not the only soul left breathing. For me, that sound came on a night when the wind carried a bitter edge, the kind that whispers rain is coming. I was pulling the barn door shut, hinges complaining, coat heavy with grit. I stopped for a moment under the lean-to, just listening to the storm gather itself. Then I heard it. Not the wind, not an animal. Softer, hesitant, coming from the front gate. My gut told me what it was before my head caught up. That's how it starts, when something you never planned on walks straight into the middle of your life. I'll tell you all of it, not because I'm looking for sympathy, but because I think some things are worth remembering, even if they hurt. Sometimes, especially if they hurt. If you're listening now, if you're here with me in this, I want you to stay. Hear the whole of it. And if it stirs something in you, if you've ever lost or been found, or stood on the edge of walking away, then I'd ask you to do a few things for me, like this video, so I know you're out there. Leave me a comment, tell me your piece of the story, and if you want to walk the rest of this trail with me, hit that subscribe button. There's more to tell, and I'd like you to hear it. Now, settle in. The wind's shifting, and I can still see that night as clear as the mountains. I remember the first thing I saw was her hand, slim, pale in the lamplight, spilling through the rain, gripping the top rail of my gate like it was the only thing holding her upright. Then my eyes followed the rope in her other hand down to the mare head low, sides heaving, a wet hide clinging to sharp ribs. She stood barefoot in the mud, toes half buried, dress plastered to her legs, strands of dark hair stuck to her cheeks, not moving, not speaking, just watching me like I might decide her fate with a single breath. I didn't move right away either. Storms have a way of slowing you down, narrowing the world to what's right in front of you. Her eyes were sharp but worn, the kind of tired you don't sleep off. Old bruises on her wrist, a fresh scrape across one knee. That was enough to tell me someone had laid claim to her, and not in any way that was worth a damn. My first thought was, she's trouble. My second was, so was I once. I unlatched the gate, the metal wet and cold under my palm. Didn't speak, didn't ask her name, just stepped aside. She flinched when she passed, eyes flicking toward me like she was bracing for a boot in the ribs. I didn't give her one. I didn't touch her at all. The mare followed without a sound, and that alone told me she'd been run hard, maybe farther than she should have. Inside, I lit the lamp low and coaxed the fire back to life. The coals still had a bit of fight in them. I didn't look at her while I worked. She stood near the door, dripping onto the floorboards, hands trembling just enough to notice, not crying, just holding herself tight, the way someone does when shaking would feel like losing ground. I pointed to the chair closest to the hearth and went to the cedar trunk by the window, pulled out a blanket worn thin but clean, and handed it to her without a word. She took it like it might disappear, wrapping it around her shoulders and leaning toward the fire in small, careful movements. I warmed beans in a pan, opened a jar of jerky, poured her well water into a tin cup, set it on the table without asking if she wanted it. When I finally sat across from her, her eyes flicked to my hand-scarred knuckles, the old burn on the back of my left. She didn't ask about them. Her own fingers gripped the blanket like a lifeline. The rain thickened, drumming the roof in heavy bursts. Minutes passed before she spoke. Her voice was raw, dry as ash. "Calla," she said. Just that. No last name, no story. I gave her a small nod. "Silas." That was enough. We didn't eat together. She stayed by the fire, taking slow sips of water, chewing like her stomach didn't quite trust the food yet. I ate standing back to the stove. Once, when I set the spoon back into the pan, she flinched, barely, but I saw it. I remembered that look from years back, before my wife ever believed my hands would only be used for work. Some kinds of fear stay deep. Later, she curled into the chair, still wrapped in the blanket, eyes wide, even as exhaustion carved deep lines into her face. I fetched another quilt and draped it over her shoulders. Didn't think about why, just did it. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. The air turned soft, full of wet earth instead of dust. I dozed in the chair by the cold stove, boots still on, hat in my lap. My back ached, but I didn't move until the light came in, thin and gray through the window. She was still curled up, knees to her chest, one hand gripping the quilt, as if she thought it might vanish. Her breathing was steady, her face softer in sleep. I moved through the house quiet, not because I was afraid to wake her, but because you don't startle someone carrying that much hurt. Outside, the mare stood tied to the fence, head low but steady on her feet. I ran my hands over her legs, found a bad sprain but nothing broken, ribs showing, mud caked into her hooves. Whoever had her before didn't care much about her health. That told me something about the man she'd come from. When I came back in, she was awake, eyes alert but not startled. I asked, "You hungry?" She nodded. I ladled oats into 2 bowls and set one at the table. She moved slowly, cautious, like her body wasn't sure it wanted to stay. After a few bites, she asked, "Is it just you here?" "Yeah," I said. "Always been?" "Not always." She didn't push. I didn't offer more. Her hands trembled slightly when she lifted the spoon. That wasn't weakness. It was the kind of tired that seeps into your bones. When she finished, she set the bowl down gentle and looked out the window. "You got anyone coming?" she asked. "No." She nodded once, like she'd guessed as much. "Is it all right if I stay a little while?" Her voice was flat, not begging, just asking, like she'd already prepared herself for the answer to be no. I studied her for a moment. She wasn't asking for shelter. Not exactly. She was asking for time, for a place where she could stop running, if only for a breath. "Few days," I said. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, eyes dropping back to the table. That was the end of it. The next hour passed in near silence. She helped wash the dishes without being asked. Watched the way I moved, where I kept things. She was memorizing the layout, a habit. Knowing the exits, knowing what's within reach. It told me more than words could. By noon, she'd changed into my late wife's old work shirt and trousers. Too big for her, but dry. She'd folded her wet dress and left it by the hearth to warm. When we stepped outside, she followed me to the corral and carried a fence rail without complaint. Said little, but didn't flinch when I raised the hammer. That was something. I didn't ask about the bruises, the bare feet, the man. I didn't need the details to know a trouble when I saw it, but I also knew this. Whatever had chased her here, she wasn't ready to tell it, and I wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. The days after she arrived took on a rhythm I didn't expect, Not my rhythm exactly, but something that bent to meet hers. She was up early, not quite with the first light, but close enough to catch the quiet before the sun burned off the cool. I never woke her. Didn't need to. When she came out of the back room, her hair was still damp from washing at the basin, my wife's shirt hanging loose on her frame. The sleeves rolled 3 times to free her hands. She never asked what needed doing. She just followed my lead, eyes always moving, taking in where the feed sacks sat, which buckets leaked, how the gate latch stuck unless you lifted it just right. There was a care to her movements that wasn't about the work. It was about staying ready. She never turned her back fully. She kept a knife from breakfast close to her seat at the table. When we worked outside, she glanced at the ridgeline now and then, not in a way that would spook stock, but enough for me to notice. Those were habits you didn't pick up in a good life. I didn't press her. I knew better. Folks carry their own weight in their own way. If she meant to tell me, she would, and if she didn't, I wouldn't get any truer for forcing it out. The mare's limp eased after a couple days. I saw her grazing by the paddock fence one morning while Calla carried wood to the porch. She worked without rush, but without pause, like stopping was harder than labor. I handed her a cup of water once, told her to sit a spell. She nodded, drank, then went right back to stacking. That told me as much as anything. Inside, she kept her space tight. She never lingered in a room if she didn't have reason to be there. At night, she curled into the cot in the back like she meant to take up as little space as possible, quilts tucked around her in a way that looked more like armor than comfort. I'd hear her shift sometimes, not restless exactly, just never fully letting herself sink. One evening I caught her staring at the shawl folded on the shelf above the hearth, my wife's. It had been there since the fire, untouched. She didn't reach for it. Just looked at it for a long moment before turning back to the stove to stir the pot. I didn't say a word. We shared our silences. Mine came from years of knowing words didn't fix anything worth fixing. I think hers came from learning that speaking gave people something to use against you. Still, there were moments when the quiet felt less like a wall and more like a truce. On the 3rd morning, she was ahead of me. I found her out by the chicken coop, scattering feed with careful, deliberate movements. She didn't see me right away, so I stood there a minute, watching. The sun was just touching the tops of the cottonwoods, the air still cool enough to keep the scent of the storm in the ground. She turned, caught my eye, and gave the smallest nod. Acknowledgement, not greeting, then went back to the work. At breakfast that day, she asked, "How long you been here?" "All my life," I said. Even after... She didn't finish, but her eyes drifted to the empty chair by the hearth. "Yeah," I said. She didn't ask why I stayed. Maybe she understood already. We went on like that, working in parallel, saying only what was needed. I showed her how to check the fence lines, where the posts sank in the wet months, how to spot the tracks of a stray dog nosing near the stock. She listened, not just with her ears, but with that whole sharpened attention of hers. I'd point once, and she'd remember. No wasted movements, no asking again. That afternoon, she tried to carry a full sack of grain from the barn to the coop, her arms strained, face set like she'd rather fall over than admit it was too heavy. I stepped in, lifted it from her without a word, and carried it the rest of the way. She didn't thank me, but she let me take it, and in her world, I figured that counted for something. Nights stayed quiet. After supper, she'd sit near the fire, legs tucked under her, eyes fixed on the flames like she was reading something in them. I'd sit across the room, mending tack or cleaning the rifle, the sound of the fire popping between us. Sometimes her gaze would shift toward me, not long, just enough to let me know she was still measuring me, even if her guard had dropped an inch. I caught myself watching her too, not out of suspicion, but because I couldn't quite figure her edges yet. There was steel in her, but it wasn't the kind that clanged when you touched it. More like a blade kept under cloth. You knew it was there by the way she carried herself, not by what she said. And though I told myself I didn't need to know her story, the truth was I was curious. Not about the man who'd hurt her. Men like that are all cut from the same bad cloth, but about what it had taken for her to get here, barefoot in the rain, holding onto a horse that was half dead and still pushing forward. But I waited. By the end of that first stretch of days, I noticed she'd stopped looking at the door every time the wind shifted. Not completely, but enough that I could see her shoulders drop when she sat at the table. That was something. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. It was late afternoon when she finally gave me the first real piece of herself. We were out on the east fence, mending a post that had rotted through at the base. The sun was dropping low, turning the light into that kind of gold that hides the sharpness of the land. I was driving a staple into the cedar when she leaned against the rail, quiet for a long moment, eyes on the horizon. "You gonna ask me where I came from?" she said. I didn't look up from the post. "You'll tell me if you want to." A small silence followed, not heavy but testing. She picked up another rail, set it in place, her movements slow. "I was with a man," she said finally. "Traveled with him a while. Didn't have much choice." I kept my hands moving, the sound of the hammer filling the space where questions might have gone. I knew what she meant by "didn't have much choice." You don't need the details to recognize the shape of that kind of life. "He'd take what he wanted, when he wanted," she went on. "Said I owed him for keeping me fed." She straightened, eyes narrowing against the sun. I kept moving, but I got tired, stopped caring if someone caught me. I paused at that, set the hammer down, and looked at her. "And then?" She didn't meet my eyes. "I ran anyway, took that mare, rode her until she couldn't give me another step. Found your gate, figured if someone was going to shoot me, might as well be someone who looked like they could still feel bad about it." I didn't laugh, didn't smile, just met her gaze with something steady. "I don't shoot people unless they give me a reason." Her mouth twitched, maybe the ghost of a smile, maybe just a habit of tightening before speaking. "Yeah," she said, "I figured." She went back to work after that, like she hadn't just handed me the first scrap of her history. But the quiet between us shifted. It wasn't that we started talking more, it was that the silence didn't feel like a locked door anymore. That night, while I boiled potatoes and she sat cleaning a pan near the stove, she looked over at me. "Your wife," she said. "What happened?" I stopped, hand hovering over the pot. "Fire. 5 years back, barn caught while I was in town. Came home to smoke." She nodded slowly, her eyes moving to the empty chair by the hearth. "I figured it was something like that." She looked back at me. "Why you keep the house like someone's still here? That chair, her shawl folded on the shelf like she's coming back for it." I didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. The next morning, I found her outside before dawn, feeding the chickens. She moved like she belonged there now, like she knew where everything was without thinking. But the piece of her that cracked open the day before was still there, visible in the way she stood straighter, no longer half-turned toward the door, as if waiting for someone to drag her away. We worked the morning in easy silence until a shadow crested the southern ridge. I spotted it first, a single rider, too far to make out, but close enough for my gut to tighten. I set down the axe and wiped the sweat from my brow, watching the horizon. She noticed the change in me before she saw him. When she did, her face drained. She stepped back, her voice low. "You know him." I kept my eyes on the rider. "Do you?" "Cabe," she said. "He rode with the man I escaped from. Could be he's here to take me back." I didn't ask for more, didn't need it. I walked to the barn, came back with my rifle, and handed it to her. Her eyes widened. "You sure? You want to run again? I won't stop you. But if you stay, you don't stay helpless." Her hand shook a little when she took it, but she didn't argue. The rider didn't come closer, just lingered on the ridge until the sun started to dip, then turned and disappeared. I watched that spot long after he was gone. That night, we didn't talk much. We sat near the fire, the rifle between us like a line drawn in the dirt. I watched the flames, thinking how trouble never announces itself fully until it's close enough to touch. She sat with her knees tucked up, the quilt pulled high, her fingers twitching every now and then, as if remembering the feel of the rifle's stock. I didn't tell her to relax. She'd earned her fear. But I knew then, in that uneasy silence at Shalbaisnan, that if she stayed, I'd protect her. Not because she was mine, she wasn't, but because I knew what it felt like to lose someone you should have protected. And I think she knew, in her own way, that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't on her own anymore. Not yet family, but no longer alone. It was the night after Cabe showed himself on the ridge that the talk turned toward things we'd both left buried. The air had a heaviness to it, not from the weather, but from the way silence stretched between us. I was at the stove, pulling the last of the salt pork from the pan, when Calla spoke. "Why'd you stay?" she asked. I glanced over. She was sitting in the chair near the hearth, knees drawn up under the quilt, eyes fixed on the flames. "Here, you mean?" She nodded. I set the pan aside, because leaving didn't feel like an answer. Her gaze shifted toward me, sharp but curious. "Not even after the fire?" I poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one, and eased down into the other chair. "Especially after the fire. I thought about it. Selling the land, walking away. Thought about putting a gun in my mouth too. But staying, it hurt, sure, still does, but leaving would have been worse." She didn't look away. "Why worse?" I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "Because something about staying, even when it hurts, feels like it matters, feels like you're not letting it take everything." For a moment, all I could hear was the pop of the wood in the fire. Then she nodded, slow. "I think I understand that." I didn't ask her if she did. Some things you either know in your bones or you don't. Later that night, after the dishes were done and I'd settled in with the Bible I barely believed in, I caught her standing at the shelf above the hearth. She'd unfolded my wife's shawl and was holding it in both hands, running her fingers over the fabric like she was feeling more than just the weave. She didn't look at me, just stood there for a long moment before folding it again with care and putting it back exactly where it had been. The next morning, we worked the garden together. She knelt beside me in the dirt, loosening the soil with her hands while I drove a post for the beans. For a while, we said nothing. Then she spoke without looking up. "I was 10 when I got sold the first time," she said. I stopped, hands still on the post driver. "Man said he needed help tending chickens, said I'd be fed." She gave a short, humorless breath. "There weren't any chickens, just a shack with a lock on the inside of the door." I didn't speak. When I got out of there, I found another girl who knew the trails west. We made it as far as Yuma, before a saloon keeper offered us coin to clean. She died that winter fever. I just kept moving. She straightened, brushed dirt from her hands. "Every place I stopped, someone found a way to make sure I owed them. Work, coin, food, it all had a price." She looked over then, and her eyes had that same sharpness I'd seen the night she showed up at my gate. "I figured if I was going to stay here, you should know what kind of life I've had." I met her gaze, steady. "It ain't the life that defines you." A pause hung there, not cold, not pity. Just recognition, 2 people who hadn't been spared much, but were still standing anyway. That afternoon, we took our coffee out to the south fence line, sitting under the cottonwood. The sun was lowering, laying gold across the grass, and the air had that stillness you only get before a change in weather. She leaned back against the trunk, her gaze following a hawk circling high overhead. "If you ever decide to send me away," she said suddenly, "just tell me straight." I didn't look at her. "If I wanted you gone, you'd be gone already." "Maybe," she said, eyes still on the sky, "but I've learned not to count on what people don't say." I turned toward her then. "Hear it now. I don't want you gone." She finally looked at me, studied my face for a beat, then gave a small nod. "I don't know what this is between us yet," I added, "but it ain't charity." "I know," she said. The wind picked up then, stirring the grass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low over the hills. We sat there a while longer, not speaking, both of us watching the horizon like we were expecting something to come over it. That night, the air inside felt different, not warmer, exactly, but less hollow. We ate biscuits and beans, the kind of simple meal that fills more than your stomach when you've worked for it. Afterward, she followed me to the porch, arms folded against the mild night air. "You think they'll come?" she asked. "Eventually. You'll be ready?" "I've been ready for worse." She stood beside me for a moment, then said, "So have I." And for the first time since she'd arrived, she rested her hand lightly on my arm, just for a second. Then she went back inside, leaving me there in the dark with the sound of the wind and the feeling that something in my chest had shifted just enough to notice. The crows found him before we did. I saw them that morning, black specks circling against a pale sky over the southern ridge. They weren't moving on like they would for a stray calf. They were riding the air in slow, patient loops. Out here, you learn to read the way the land talks, and crows don't circle for no reason. Calla came up from the chicken coop with the feed bucket in one hand, her steps slower than usual. Ridge was quiet, she said, setting the bucket down. Then her eyes shifted toward the dark shapes overhead. But the crows are back. I poured coffee into a tin cup, stared at the fence line like it might answer me. There's eyes on us somewhere, I said finally. She didn't flinch. We leave? I shook my head. No, this is my land. If they want something, they can come ask for it. And if they don't ask... I took a slow sip. Then they find out what happens when they don't. She stood there for a moment watching me. No fear in her face this time. Just a steady, quiet readiness. We didn't talk much that day. We didn't have to. She moved through her work with purpose, checking the water buckets, stacking wood by the stove, making sure the cellar was stocked. Every task she did, I noticed the way she kept her eyes, the moving windows, doors, the line of the ridge. It wasn't panic, it was preparation. By dusk, I'd cleaned the rifles and checked every hinge on the gates. I showed her the trapdoor to the cellar under the rug in the back room. If I tell you to go, you go, I said. She met my eyes without hesitation. Only if you're behind me. I didn't argue, just gave her a small nod and moved on. That night, we didn't bother with supper. Coffee was enough. The fire burned low while the rest of the house stayed dark. Calla sat with the rifle across her lap, boots tied tight, hair pulled back. I could see in her face that she'd already decided, no, running this time. You think it's him? She asked quietly. It's been long enough for word to spread, I said. Someone will come sniffing if they haven't already. She leaned back slightly, jaw set. He doesn't leave things unfinished. If he's not already here, he's close. I studied her for a moment. You sure it's worth staying? You still got time to run. She didn't look away. Not running anymore, remember? A long pause settled between us. Then she asked, You scared? I took a slow breath. Yeah. Her eyes didn't widen. She just nodded once. Me too. We didn't sleep. We took turns stepping onto the porch, listening to the night. The moon rose high, cold and white over the ridge, then slid west. Somewhere between that and dawn, I heard it, a faint crunch out past the corral, like boots on gravel. Careful, slow. I stepped back inside. She was already standing, rifle in her hands. They're here, I said. She didn't ask how I knew. I blew out the lamp. The room dropped into shadow, only the dull orange of the coals in the hearth throwing any light. 20 minutes might have passed, maybe more. Then footsteps on the porch, steady, deliberate. A voice came through the door, low and certain. Girl, I know you're in there. Calla's grip tightened on the rifle. You made it farther than most, the voice went on. But you should have kept running. Thought you'd be smart hiding out with a lonely old man. She took a slow breath, her face still. You know how this ends, Calla. You open that door, I'll make it quick. You don't, and I'll come in slow. She looked at me. I nodded once, moved to the wall beside the door, my rifle up. The voice hardened. Bradock, you open this door and hand her over, and we ain't got to do this the ugly way. She's not going anywhere, I said. A pause, then a short, crooked laugh. Suit yourself, old man. The sound of glass shattering from the side window came a heartbeat later. I swung toward it, catching a shadow moving outside. Wood splintered at the back door. They're coming from both sides, I said. Calla moved to the trapdoor, opened it, but didn't go down. Stay with me, she said. Stay low, I told her, stepping toward the back door, rifle steady. The first blow to the door was a test. The second was heavier. The third broke it. A booted man stepped in fast, gun drawn, but I didn't give him the chance to use it. My shot dropped him where he stood. Another voice shouted outside. Then a second man came through the shattered window, swinging his weapon toward the table where Calla crouched. But she was faster. Her shot cracked through the room, and he dropped hard, half taking the porch frame with him. Then silence. I moved to the front door, scanned the yard. Nothing moved. When I turned back, she was standing now, breathing sharp but steady, her rifle still in hand. Clear, I said quietly. She nodded, lowered the rifle. By sunup, we'd dragged the bodies to the edge of the property. said nothing while we worked. No words for men like that. The land could take them. When we got back to the house, she sat on the porch steps with her coffee. I joined her, rubbing my palms together. "You all right?" I asked. "I didn't freeze," she said. "No, you didn't. I always thought I would when it counted. You didn't." She looked out at the paddock, where the mare walked easy now. "He won't come. That was his last move. He never shows when the men he sends don't return." "Good," I said. "He can keep losing." She gave me a small, quiet smile, the first I'd seen from her. "I think I'd like to stay." "You already are," I told her. After that night, the ranch felt different. Not because the work changed, fences still broke, water buckets still needed filling, and the chickens still scattered just far enough to make you curse under your breath, but because she stopped moving like someone with one foot out the door. Calla rose with the first light now, same as me, her steps steady, her eyes clear. She didn't ask what to do, she already knew. I'd find her in the mornings pulling water from the well, shoulders squared, the rope biting into her hands, or bent over the garden, pulling weeds in that patient, methodical way that doesn't rush for the sake of being done. She'd hum sometimes, just a low thread of sound, the kind that dies quick if you draw attention to it. I never said a word about it. She told me more, though never all at once. Bits of her past came in like the slow seep of water through the dry soil, enough to darken the ground, not enough to drown it. One evening while mending the tack, she said, "You ever grow up somewhere and not belong to it?" I looked at her over the leather strap in my hands. "No, but I've belonged to people I wish I hadn't." Her mouth pulled into something between a smirk and a flinch. "Same thing in the end." That was as far as she took it, but the weight in her voice said enough. She worked hard, too hard, sometimes, like stopping might invite something to catch up. I caught her more than once trying to carry a load meant for 2 people. A sack of feed, a full pail from the well. I'd take it from her without asking, and she'd let me, though never without that little pause where she measured whether to keep fighting it. Each time the pause got shorter. The small things told me more than any confession. The way she stopped checking the ridge every time the wind shifted. How she'd leave the rifle leaning by the door instead of keeping it within arm's reach at the table. How she started leaving her boots by the hearth at night, as if she trusted there'd be no need to run barefoot into the dark. We still didn't fill the air with talk. That wasn't our way. But the silences had changed shape. They weren't the kind that kept you apart. They were the kind you could rest inside. One night, over stew, I told her, "This place needed a reason to keep standing." She glanced at me, brow furrowed. "And?" "You gave it one." She looked down into her bowl, not smiling exactly, but softer. "You make it sound like I'm worth the trouble." "You are," I said, and didn't dress it up with anything more. The next day, we rode the north boundary together. I showed her the old spring, where the water still ran clear, even of it in the worst heat. She tied her mare beside mine and knelt to drink straight from the flow, cupping her hands, the cold running between her fingers. She looked younger in that moment, not by age, but by the absence of weight on her shoulders. "You think I'll run?" she asked later, when we stopped under the shade of the ridge. "I think you've had to," I said. She studied me for a long second. "I don't want to." I nodded, and something in my chest eased without me meaning it to. We headed back slow, the sun at our backs, the kind of quiet between us that felt like agreement. That evening she took over the kitchen without asking. Fried up biscuits, warmed beans, and sliced a bit of the salt pork I'd been saving. I sat on the porch listening to the rattle of pans and thought how, for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like it was waiting for something that would never come back. After we ate, she lingered by the table. "You know," she said, "I've never had a place where I could set something down and trust it'd be there in the morning." "You do now," I told her. She leaned back in the chair, eyes on me. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "It's not a promise," I said. "It's just the way it is." The fire burned low that night, and instead of taking her coffee to the corner chair, she brought it to the one beside me, sat close enough that her sleeve brushed mine when she lifted the cup. She didn't say anything else, and neither did I, but I felt it, the shift from being 2 people weathering the same storm to something more solid, something you could build on, not by planning it, not by naming it, just by staying. And in my world, staying has always been the hardest thing to do. The wind changed before the trouble showed itself. You can smell it in the air if you've lived in one place long enough, the sharpness that cuts through the usual dust and sage, the way the sound around you shifts. Birds go quiet, even the dog stops his lazy loops along the fence line. That morning the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, but it had the kind of stillness that didn't belong. I was at the garden, coil of wire over my shoulder, when I noticed Calla standing by the porch with her arms folded, looking toward the ridge. She wasn't just staring, she was measuring distance. "Something out there?" I asked. She didn't take her eyes off the horizon. "Feels like it." I set down the post driver, followed her gaze. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean much. The quiet had weight to it. We didn't talk about running, that wasn't on the table anymore, but we did start moving with purpose. I cleaned and oiled both rifles, laid out the ammunition where we could get to it quick. Calla went through the cellar, pulling out lanterns, rope, the small stash of extra shells we kept down there. She stacked kindling by the stove, filled the water buckets, moved the feed sacks in closer to the house. It wasn't panic, it was the kind of work you do when you know what's coming, but don't know when it will arrive. By midday, the wind had picked up, carrying the faintest scent of rain, though the clouds were still holding back. Calla came in from the chicken yard, with her hair pulled back tight and her jaw set. She'd stopped humming in the mornings. That was one of the first signs the easy days were gone. "You figure it's him?" she asked while she rinsed her hands at the basin. "Could be," I said. "Could be someone else sniffing around." She glanced over her shoulder. "Makes no difference to me." I knew she meant it, but I also knew the truth. There's always a difference. The man from her past wasn't just another troublemaker. He was the kind who'd made a habit of ownership, the kind who couldn't stand losing what he thought was his. That afternoon, I walked her farther out than we'd gone before, past the north fence line and into the brush. I showed her the old hunting trail that curled back toward the spring, the one that would keep you hidden from anyone riding hard along the ridge. "If you ever need to disappear fast," I told her, "this is the way." She gave me a sidelong look. "You planning on me needing to?" "I'm planning on being ready," I said. She didn't argue, just nodded once and kept pace with me as we followed the trail back. When we got home, she stopped by the barn, leaning in the doorway while I checked the tack. "You think I'll run?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the saddle strap I was tightening. "I think you've had to before." "I don't want to," she said. I nodded without looking up. "Then don't." It was that simple. Or maybe it wasn't, but we both wanted to believe it was. That night, the air was thick enough to taste. The sun went down behind a bank of dark clouds, and the light in the house felt dimmer than usual, even with the lamp turned up. We ate little just bread and cheese, neither of us with much appetite. Afterward, we sat by the hearth, both of us watching the windows without meaning to. Calla had the rifle across her lap, her fingers loose but ready. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, coffee cooling in my hands. "You scared?" she asked. "Always am, when I know something's coming," I said. She gave a small nod. "Me too." We didn't bother pretending otherwise. Later, I stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up again, blowing warm and dry despite the threat of rain earlier. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the faint shift of gravel, the kind that comes from boots, not hooves. It was too distant to be certain. Still, I stayed out there a while, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, scanning the tree line and the ridge. When I came back in, Calla was still in her chair, her eyes on the door. "Nothing yet," I told her. She didn't answer, just rested the rifle against her shoulder and kept listening. We turned in late, but neither of us slept. The kind of quiet we were in now wasn't the good kind we'd learned to share. This was the kind that waits with you, patient as a snake in the grass. I lay there thinking about how much had changed since the night she showed up at my gate. Back then, letting her in had been a decision made in the moment, no thought past a dry blanket and a warm fire. Now, the idea of her being taken from here made something deep in me go cold. And that was the truth of it. I wasn't just preparing to defend the ranch anymore, I was preparing to defend her. It started quiet, the kind of quiet that works its way under your skin. I'd been sitting by the fire, cup of coffee cooling in my hands, while Calla cleaned the rifle for the third time that week. The wind outside had died down to nothing. No creak in the porch boards, no soft rattle of the barn doors, just stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath. Somewhere past midnight I heard it, a faint crunch, gravel shifting under weight. Not close yet, but not far either. I set the cup down and stood, my boots making no sound on the worn planks of the floor. Calla was already looking at me, eyes sharp, hands stilling on the rifle. "They're here," I said. She didn't ask how I knew. I crossed the room and blew out the lamp. The house dropped into shadow, the only light the dull red of the coals in the hearth. We waited. 20 minutes, maybe more. Time gets slippery when you're listening that hard. Then came the sound of boots on the porch. Slow, deliberate. A voice followed, low and sure. "Girl, I know you're in there." I saw her fingers tighten around the rifle. "You made it farther than most," the man went on. "But you should have kept running. Thought you were smart, hiding out with a lonely old man." I kept my breathing even. "You know how this ends, Calla," he said. "You open that door, I'll make it quick. You don't, I'll come in slow." She looked at me then, her eyes steady. I gave a small nod. The voice shifted, harder now. "Bradock, you open this door and hand her over, and we ain't got to do this the ugly way." "She's not going anywhere," I said. Silence. Then a short, sharp laugh. "Suit yourself, old man." Glass shattered on the far side of the room. I swung toward it, catching the shape of a man outside. Before I could move, the back door shuddered under a heavy blow. They were coming from both sides. "Stay low," I told her, stepping toward the kitchen where the back entrance sat half hidden. The second hit nearly splintered the door. The third drove it open, hinges groaning, a boot crossing the threshold. He was fast, gun in hand, but I was faster. My shot caught him center, and he dropped without a word. A shout came from outside. Then another man appeared through the broken window, his weapon aimed toward the table where Calla crouched. But she didn't freeze. Her shot cracked through the air, dropping him hard. The force carried him halfway out the window before he slid to the porch, dragging a piece of the frame with him. Then there was nothing. No more voices, no more boots, only the ringing in my ears and the faint hiss of the fire. I moved to the door, scanned the yard. Dark. Empty. When I turned back, she was standing now, breathing sharp but steady, rifle still in her hands. "Clear," I said quietly. She nodded once and lowered the barrel. We didn't speak while we worked. At first light, we dragged the bodies to the far edge of the property. The earth was hard underfoot, the air cold enough to bite. There was no ceremony, no final words, just the work of removing what didn't belong. We left them there, letting the land take care of the rest. When it was done, we went back to the house. She sank down onto the porch steps, the coffee I'd handed her steaming in the morning chill. I sat beside her, rubbing my palms together. "You all right?" I asked. She took a sip, eyes still on the yard. "I didn't freeze." "No," I said. "You didn't. I always thought I would, when it counted." "You didn't," I told her again, because it was the truth, and she needed to hear it twice. The mare moved lazily in the paddock, her limp long gone. The sun was just beginning to burn the frost off the grass. "He won't come now," she said. "That was his last move. He never shows up when the men he sends don't return. Cuts his losses." "Good," I said. "He can keep losing." She gave me the smallest smile, quiet, real, the first one I'd seen since she stepped through my gate that stormy night. "I think I'd like to stay," she said. I didn't have to think on it. "You already are." She turned her head toward me, searching my face. "You don't mind?" I let out a breath, slow. "I've fixed that porch twice since you got here, boarded the window 3 times. You're more trouble than you're worth." That smile of hers widened just a little, enough to reach her eyes. "But truth is," I went on, "this house needed a reason to stay standing. You gave it one." We sat there a while longer, side by side, coffee cooling in our hands. No talk of what came next, no promises, no speeches, just 2 people who'd fought for the same ground and lived to see the morning. Inside, the fire was still burning low. I figured it would be easy enough to coax it back, and maybe that was the whole thing, keeping the fire going, not letting it die just because the night had been long. The days after the shooting passed without incident, though peace out here is never something you take for granted. It isn't a blanket that settles over you and keeps you warm. It's more like a thin quilt you're always mending, knowing the wind can still cut through. Still, the air around the ranch felt different now, not tight with waiting, but loosened, like the land itself had exhaled. Calla moved through those days as if she'd finally claimed the space she'd been circling. She didn't hover by the door anymore. She left her boots by the hearth without a glance back. She hummed again in the mornings, low and tuneless, while carrying water from the well. It wasn't loud, but I heard it. I heard everything now. The work kept on, same as always. We fixed the last of the broken fence posts from the storm. We cleared the north pasture of deadfall. She took to feeding the mare herself, brushing her down slow, talking to her in that quiet way people do when they're half speaking to themselves. One evening, after we'd finished supper and were sitting on the porch, she said, "I keep waiting for it to feel temporary again." I looked at her, the fading light laying gold across her face. "Does it?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." We didn't need to say the rest. That was the truth of it. She'd stopped bracing for the ground to shift beneath her, and I'd stopped expecting the house to feel empty again. I'd always believed that staying put, no matter how much it hurt, was its own kind of defiance, that you could outlast the things that wanted to hollow you out just by refusing to move. But watching her now, I understood something else. Sometimes the staying isn't just for yourself. Sometimes it's so someone else can stop running. We didn't make declarations, that's not the kind of people we are, but there were small things, steady things that said more. She started leaving her coffee cup in the same spot on the porch rail. She hung her coat on the same hook by the door each night. She knew without asking where the spare nails were, which gate stuck in the rain, how much grain the chickens went through in a week. One morning, the neighbor rode by on his way to town, slowed his horse when he saw her working the fence with me. "Bradock," he called, nodding toward her. "Who's the girl?" Before I could answer, Calla straightened, wiped her hands on her trousers, and said, "Name's Calla." The neighbor tipped his hat, rode on, and that was that. No questions about where she'd come from, no muttering about who she belonged to, and I realized that, around here, the less you say, the more it settles. By the time spring came proper, the land was waking up in that slow, stubborn way it does after winter. The grass pushed green at the roots, the air carried the smell of wet earth and new growth. Calla planted beans in neat rows, set the stakes herself. I watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, and thought how 5 months ago I wouldn't have believed I'd see this. Her knees in the dirt, sleeves rolled up, working like it was her land too. One night, when the work was done and the fire was low, she asked me, "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd said no that night?" I thought on it. "No," I said finally, "because I didn't." She gave me a small smile, the kind that lingers just enough to leave its mark. "Guess I didn't either," she said. "There's a lot a man can lose in a lifetime. I know that better than most. But there's something I learned from her loss isn't the end unless you decide to stop building. Some days it's hard as hell. Some days you carry more weight than you should. But if you keep the fire lit, keep the place standing, sometimes someone will walk through your gate who makes it worth it. And if they do, you'd better let them in." So that's the story. A woman who showed up in the rain, holding on to a half-dead horse and nothing else. A man who thought he'd run out of reasons to open the door. Somehow we met in the middle and decided to stay there. If you've listened this far, maybe you've carried your own kind of loss. Maybe you've had to start over in the quiet. Maybe you've learned that trust isn't something you hand out. It's something you keep and share only when it feels like the ground might hold. If you have, then you know this isn't a story about saving someone or being saved. It's about two people who stopped running, for different reasons, and found they could hold the same ground without taking it from each other. Now, if you're sitting there with your own kind of quiet and this story stirred something in you, I'd ask you for a favor. Like the video. Leave me a comment. Tell me about a time you stayed when it would have been easier to go. And if you want to hear more stories like this, follow the channel. There's always another trail to walk, and I'd like you to walk it with me. The wind's picking up again outside, carrying that smell of spring rain. She'll be in soon, boots muddy from the garden, hair pulled back, eyes bright. In that way they get when the day's work is done. I'll put another log on the fire, pour 2 cups, and we'll sit like we always do, side by side, saying nothing we don't need to say. Because that's the thing about belonging. You don't have to talk it to death. You just have to live it.